Hello everyone, and thank you so much for having me and all of the work that is being done in terms of cancelling debt for countries like Sri Lanka. I really appreciate it. Even though the interest in countries like Sri Lanka is still quite little, that is also somewhat due to colonialism. Like we still don't understand the crisis that we are in. We still don't understand how the global financial architecture works or how Sri Lanka can actually work within it to benefit us. So just to get a snapshot, even for the recent debt restructuring agreements or the negotiations, we had to hire people from the USA and the UK. So there are very few organizations who do that. For Sri Lanka, it's the Lazard and Clifford Chance companies. So there are conflicts of interest as well. So I'm going to use a presentation which has quite a lot of info. I'm not going to go through each and everything, but I have put in a lot of information. So if anybody wants, you can take pictures or search some information later. Thank you. So this is just a snapshot of Sri Lanka in terms of the importance of the biodiversity. The country is one of the 35 biodiversity hotspots in the world. There are quite a number of importance in terms of endemism. And also, this is an island that has 103 major rivers. And we have a history of a nation that that was dependent on agriculture and also a man-made reservoir system. So so we currently have a population of 21 million, and the island is only 62,000 square kilometers. Yeah. Next one. Yeah. So just a brief overview of the colonial history of the island. We were first colonized by European colonizers in the 55, so that was the Portuguese, and they could only they were only in the coastal areas, but they started getting into spice trade, and also spreading of Christianity also happened during the Portuguese era. And then the Dutch replaced the Portuguese in the 1658. That was the Dutch East India Company, and they were quite interested in the spice trade and created a monopoly on the coastal areas. And then the British occupation in the 1796. So this is what led to the total colonization of the whole island, because both the Portuguese and the Dutch couldn't colonize the whole country, but the British occupation ended up colonizing the whole country. And that not only led to engagements in trade and religion, but also into changing the whole social fabric of the island itself. Sri Lanka is an island that has several ethnicities living in the island, and post-British colonization era, we are experiencing segregation that happened during the colonization still today. So during the first 10 years of the colonization, also British understood that it is actually quite expensive to run the country. So this leads to the giving Sri Lanka independence in 1948, but this happens through a series a series of incidents that lead to an independence in the 1948. So in 1931, it was a Donovan Commission, but people didn't really have the right to vote, and there were so many structural adjustments that was being done at that time, like we're experiencing today. Yeah, next slide. So in terms of debt and development and sovereignty, I have highlighted a few incidents. So for the first time, Sri Lanka gets a foreign loan from the World Bank. in the 1951. So this was to build a road that goes from an area called Matale up to Kandy, where the previous kingdom was. So only after taking over the kingdom, and even after the independence, the roads are being built and we are getting loans for development projects. So Sri Lanka was then called Ceylon before independence, and Ceylon Railway Project was another infrastructure project where we received loans for. And then we also started getting development projects. So when it was decided that Sri Lanka wasn't a developed country, even though we did have a quite successful civilizations before, and we had a tax system, we had land deeds, we had women who owned land, but we were not developed enough. So there was the start for the first development project. So this Galway development project was mainly focused on agriculture. And along with that, we also started having green revolution and then the spread of cash crops. So the traditional agricultural practices in Sri Lanka involved mixed crop cultivation, which actually protected and supported biodiversity. And the agricultural systems were very in line with the natural weather patterns. So we have 2 seasons where we cultivate, and so this also gives the natural ecosystems time to regenerate. But with the introduction of green revolution and the chemical fertilizer and pesticides, the focus was more and more put on cash crops and monoculture. And Galloy Development Project was a testing ground for that. And this project actually ended up dislocating a lot of indigenous people who were known as the Vedda community, the Adivasi community of Sri Lanka. They lost a lot of land. In addition to them, the Tamil minorities who were living there also lost land. And then the Sinhala majority and another Muslim minority who were also relocated with this agricultural project through created more issues and more conflicts within the communities. So this is in addition to the habitat loss, deforestation, land degradation, and all of the natural impacts that we see. Next. So fast forward to 2000s, because if we're going to talk all about the years, it's going to be quite long. So I have added the history from the year 2000 to up to 2020. So the 20 years of history of the recent debt. The dark lines here represents international financial institutes, so which means the private loans that we have taken, private debt. And then the orange line represents foreign governments, bilateral debt. And the green international finance, the green indicates the ISB, international sovereign bond markets. And the maroon ones is the multilateral, so the IMF, World Bank as such. So Sri Lanka first goes to international sovereign bond market in the year 2007. And this is 3 years after the Indian Ocean tsunami, which created a massive damage to Sri Lanka. We lost several lives. The infrastructure damage was so much, but somehow it was considered a good decision for Sri Lanka to go to international sovereign bond markets 3 years after this massive disaster where so many people suffered. And also it's important to note that up until 2009, Sri Lanka did have a civil conflict. And also we had very high military spending during these times. And this civil conflict went on for 30 years, between the Sinhalese majority and the Tamil minority. And the decision to go to the ISB bond market occurs in the year 2007, while the ethnic conflict is still going on. And starting from 2009, after the civil conflict ended, costing a lot of lives. It has seen very high deforestation and habitat destruction because of all the investment that started coming into the country. And throughout all of these periods, though, we could see that economic reform continued post-colonial era. And it was continuously, the country was being forced to do structural adjustments to fit the global financial market. Yeah. Next one. So in the year 2022, so Sri Lanka had a massive protest movement where millions of people came together, and we actually had an Occupy movement that went on for 4 months with the hopes of ousting the previous president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was there. But before that, leading to this protest movement or this mass uprising of the people, in 2021, Sri Lanka had two ISB payments due. So one was $1 billion and another one was $500 million. And both of these were paid. And so this started becoming the start of the crisis or start of the default. It's also argued that Sri Lanka was not careful in the way how we handled this default, because we knew that we were running out of foreign currency because we had to keep paying the ISB debt. And with this, there was also this overnight chemical fertilizer ban, which impacted the food security massively. So this is also a very good example of how not to do green transitioning. How not to do an overnight transition without consulting the farmers, without consulting the grassroots. But this decision was taken mainly because the country did not have money to import fertilizer and pesticides. And also, there were so many other things that was contributing to this decision. But it is important to highlight that making rash decisions which seemingly good for the environment or seemingly called green, but if they are not very well planned and thought through, or the grassroots are not consulted, that it could bear very harsh repercussions, which ended up impacting Sri Lanka's food security massively. And in year 2022, again, due to the country not having enough foreign reserves, we ran out of fuel, gas, electricity. There was a medicine scarcity, and the food inflation reached 90%. So you could see, massive lines and queues on the streets. Over 20 people recorded dying while staying in the fuel queues and gas queues due to heat. And these lines sometimes went on for days. People were taking turns at staying in fuel kiosks. Sometimes you would go and park your vehicle and come back home and go back again, or you will have like a different family member going and staying in line. So like this, it was creating this massive impact on the people. So which actually forced people to get out on the streets. So people who would normally will not get involved in the protest, people who would normally, who won't normally go and join protest movements, ended up getting out because it made it increasingly difficult for people to tolerate what was happening. So 4 months of an Occupy movement, massive protest, millions of people come out, and people occupy the presidential secretariat building, prime minister's building, and the president's secretariat building. So after all three buildings were taken over by the people, the then President Gotabaya Rajapaksa leaves the country. 2 days later, he sends in his resignation. So then comes to the interesting part that none of us really thought through, because the movement was very decentralized. So the main demand we had was asking for the president to leave. So after the president left, it was highlighted that a lot of people didn't want to try non-democratic means, everybody thought that, like, yes, we need to go through the democratic process to elect a new government or to elect a new president. So then what happened? The cabinet, the cabinet of ministers, or the government who was rejected by the people, who was actually at this point were even scared to use their normal vehicles to go on the road or come and meet the people, ended up taking a vote in the parliament, the 225 MPs. They voted a man who came to the parliament through the national list. So national list means you're not elected, but because your party receives a certain number of votes, they're given a chance to nominate somebody. So that's how the last president we had in Sri Lanka was elected. He was never elected by the people. He could never win an election ever in the country. But through the national list, he was in the parliament, so he was elected as the president. So this new caretaker president was highly supported by the IMF. And then under his presidency, Sri Lanka went to the IMF for the 17th time, and for which we received a 2.9 billion loan under a 4-year extended fund facility. And this resulted in imposing austerity measures that had a massive impact on the people's lives. Next slide, Ben. Yeah. So the IMF bailout and the economic recovery program, as it was called at the time, this basically cut subsidies on essential goods like fuel and electricity. And it is important to note, even after 75 years after the independence, since 1948, Sri Lanka is one of the countries that still has free education and free healthcare. So we do have private education institutes, we do have private healthcare institutes operating in the country, but the government provided education up to the higher education, and also the healthcare is 100% free in Sri Lanka still. So, we were also given subsidies for fuel and electricity, which was cut during the IMF austerity program, and the increasing taxes. So interestingly, IMF has only told the government to increase the taxes. They never told which tax to increase. So the government increased indirect tax and not the direct tax. So this had a massive impact on the poor people, marginalized groups, daily wage earners, who had to pay for tax in every single item that was brought from the market. And there was also pushes to reduce government expenditure. So this include railway and so many other public facilities. And this also suggested to float the Sri Lankan rupee, so allowing it to depreciate against the dollar. So this created further inflation. And there was also a decline in social protection. So the IMF targets mainly were focused on fiscal targets. It didn't have any social protection targets, but they did have a social spending flow, which was way below the global average. Next one. So I have a few facts and figures on how the austerity was experienced by the people. Over 17% of the people were food insecure, and about 31% of the children under age of 5 were found to be malnourished. So the problem when we talk about malnourishment, we sometimes think it's just a present issue. But when we're talking about malnourishment of children, this means a problem that would persist for another 30 to 50 years at least, given how this is going to impact the children's growth and nourishment. More than 59 families couldn't meet basic food requirements, and there were news reports of people reducing 3 meals to 2 meals, 2 meals to 1 meal, and even more. And then and the parents were sending children to their schools had to decide which child to be sent to school. Usually it ended up buying the girl child. And this was also due to high costs of education, materials, and books and pens and everything. And yeah, so we also had like over 500,000 households had to disconnect their electricity because the electricity cost surged by over 400% for the low-income households. And inflation was more than 50%, and a lot of people were struggling to meet their needs to purchase essential goods. And health and education was impacted. And also, interestingly, we keep hearing this term that free the market, free the people. But over the last 2 years, it was very evident in Sri Lanka that is not the case, because the dissent was repressed brutally, citing the need for economic stability. I think for after the protest movement, still to date, we haven't really been able to do any protest marches. Every time it's met with very high repression from the government, that they settle to tear gassing, sending water cannons, and physically assaulting people. We also experienced a new anti-terrorism act that was introduced, and an online safety act that curtailed freedom of speech. All of this within the last 2 years that was implemented alongside of IMF reforms. Yeah, next one then. Yeah. So I have highlighted few points here, that few highlights from the last 2 years under the caretaker government. So number one that I haven't mentioned here is that the Sri Lankan people were refused our right to vote. So there is a case that was filed in the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was supposed to have our provincial council elections in the year 2022, but the elections were postponed, saying that we didn't have enough money to have the elections, and also saying that there were think tanks and there were economic experts who kept saying that an election could harm economic stability. And within these 2 years, under this caretaker president, who was supported by the IMF, 99 laws were passed. And most of these laws were focused at doing structural adjustments to the country to support the IMF recommendations. So it's also important to highlight that the mechanisms that we have here currently does not allow bills to be it only allows 2 weeks to challenge in the court since the time that bill has been passed through the parliament. So it gives a very little window for anybody to study the bill and actually challenge it in the courts. But several of these bills were challenged in the courts, and but a lot of them were still passed through the parliament with the parliamentary majority, because it was still the same government that was rejected by the people. And the other one was lack of transparency. So most of these bills did not go through consultation processes. And also the IMF recommendations or IMF conditions were never ever shared in local languages. No consultations were held with the grassroots. And people had little to no idea what the IMF is and what IMF is doing and what these conditions are. And also for the and also before we went into debt restructuring negotiations with the bilateral creditors or the ISB creditors, we were told that we have to restructure domestic debt so it would give more confidence to the international creditors that Sri Lanka is strong to pay back the debt. So the government ended up using social security funds, to be precise, employee provident funds, to use for the debt restructuring process. So this is something that has never happened in anywhere in the world. No country has ever used social security funds for debt restructuring. But in Sri Lanka, we ended up taking money off from the Employee Provident Fund, basically reducing the benefits that the fund holders would receive in order to restructure domestic debt. And also the now currently, right now, we have two debt restructuring agreements. Sri Lanka has already come into an agreement or a settlement with the bilateral creditors, which means the other countries, including the wealthy nations. This happened under the previous government, but the current government is saying that it's difficult to go back. And also, just 2 days before the last presidential election that Sri Lanka had in September 21, the previous president announced that Sri Lanka is no longer bankrupt because we have restructured our ISBs, international sovereign bonds. But this agreement is criticized as one of the worst debt restructuring agreements a poor country like Sri Lanka has ever agreed to. And in addition to the haircut that we received being very minimal, and it's being tied to the GDP, where if our GDP grows, that we'll have to pay more, and the GDP reduces, we have to, like our payments will reduce. There's also this quite interesting predicament where we have given away our right to ever seek debt justice through legal means, which means we have allowed the creditors to choose which law that the bond should be governed under. The governing law can be changed if the creditors are willing. And as far as I know, that Suriname has agreed to a similar condition in their debt agreements. But in Suriname, the country has the power to veto that decision if a creditor decides to change the governing law. But in Sri Lanka's case, we have not even kept that right. So this means more than 50% of Sri Lanka's ISBs are currently governed under New York law. So if we are allowing the creditors to choose what law that they should be governed under, that means we will never be able to seek debt justice for these bonds, whereas some of them are from the vulture funds. And with these new reforms or the structural changes or the adjustments that was done to the country, one of the major bills was called the Economic Transformation Act. This act is already passed, and this has a major impact on how the foreign investments were working in Sri Lanka. We used to have a board of investment, which will now be abolished, and there will be a different mechanism for them to be dealt with. Currently, or before this bill passed, if you are to invest in Sri Lanka, you need to have a Sri Lankan partner in the same business. But now these barriers are being removed, and which means there's more and more vulnerability for the country's natural resources to be overexploited. Also, none of these debt agreements have gone through a human rights impact assessments. I apologize, I have mentioned it twice. But it's very important to mention twice, I think, given that there's this increasing dialogue on how debt and economy is related to human rights, because we can clearly see it from our eyes. But all of these debt agreements should ideally be going through a human rights impact assessment before being passed. But currently, these are happening with little to no transparency and with little to no focus on how human rights are impacted. And the privatization of state-owned enterprises were highly promoted with the help of local businesses and some of the investors as well. I think it's also important to mention that we are also seeing a boom or a rapid increase in random think tanks that keeps popping up, who have very colorful, attractive communication, but very little presence on the ground or in the grassroots. So we have this like, a lot of information that is being shared in support of IMF reforms, but nobody really knows where the information is coming from. But because it's attractive, it's easy for people to digest, to understand, they get really popular quite easily. And another important point is that Sri Lanka has had over $81 billion of illicit financial flows has been recorded by Global Financial Integrity. It's a think tank based in US. So according to them, between 2009 to 2019, more than $81 billion has been taken out of Sri Lanka. So this also indicates a capital flight, mainly which has happened through trade misinvoicing. So over the last 2 years, there has been no focus on investigating this from the government, and there has been no political will at all. Yes, so I think that brings us to the end of the presentation. And I have added quite a lot of info and trying to add more, trying to add little more on how the environment is impacted. I think the main problem is when we look at these development projects that we don't have proper environment impact assessment processes being done. There's one more slide. Yeah, we can go now. Yeah. So yes. So we have this Chinese-funded port city, which actually created an external island in the western part of the island, which was created without a proper environmental impact assessment. So it was halted after a regime change. But then again, because the project has already started and the damage was already done, the project restarted, right? So there are so many cases like this, and there are so many white elephant projects where lots of borrowing has gone into, but they're not really creating any economic value or any sort of value to the country. Like, few of them that I can mention is like, we have a airport in southern part of the island, which doesn't get used at all. If you search up on the least used airport in the world, Mattala Airport in Sri Lanka might come up. And also these infrastructure projects have had a massive negative impact on the local or the rural economy. So for the farmers and fisheries, they see heightened pollution, and especially for farmers, we see human and wildlife conflicts being accelerating. Sri Lanka actually ranks #1 for both human deaths and elephant deaths due to human-elephant conflict in the whole world. I think for the past 5 or 6 consecutive years, this has been the case. This is due to Sri Lanka having a large population of elephants who are also considered threatened because they're also an endemic species. But at the same time, we do not really have a way of addressing this, because these infrastructure projects just keep happening without understanding the environmental impact. And we are also seeing a lot of investments now are coming into the country under the guise of green financing and carbon credit, and also carbon offsets, blue bonds, green bonds. So there's like all sorts of these names, but at the end of the day, what all of these are just financial tools that help maintaining business as usual without really focusing on the root cause of the issue, which is this growth model, or which is this idea of development that only focuses on GDP and that only focuses on infrastructure development. And the modernized agriculture methods that we are being introduced are also removing us increasingly from the traditional agricultural methods and also causing biodiversity loss and habitat destruction. And because also we are desperate for foreign investments, there's a major push to removing red tape, which also means the bureaucratic red tapes that are sometimes put in place to protect the environment. And yes, so there's the Economic Transformation Act has committed to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. But the problem is, if you consider global emissions, Sri Lanka's emissions is little to no. I mean, it's insignificant. Right? So most of these investments that are coming are also focused heavily on adaptation, but we are focusing very little on mitigation. Yes, so I think that is it. I have covered all the slides, but I'm happy to answer if there are any questions. And I hope I wasn't too fast.
So I've got a question then. Perhaps it's about the debt for climate. I mean, it's not that I would in any way begrudge any global south country. I think their debt should be cancelled, full stop. But do we, if looking at it from the climate perspective, do we have any reason to think that it would be that the money from the debts would be actually used to mitigate the climate crisis, given that their needs for so many other things are so great?
Yeah, well, the point that Melanie and I were both making, I think, is that because the global debt burden that is being placed, the debt burden that's being placed on the global south has made them so abjectly poor that they can't afford to do anything in terms of environmental protection or looking after their own people. So, for example, you know, if you're dirt poor and you live near some trees and you've got to cut down the trees in order to be able to grow some beans, that's what you're going to do because you can't afford to do anything else. Or if you need wood for fuel, or you can't afford to buy solar panels, this type of thing. There's a direct correlation between poverty and environmental degradation. It's exactly what Munich Re said, that this indebtedness of global south countries by global north, it leads to environmental degradation directly.
Just to follow up, that completely makes sense in terms of regulations. You'd cut down a forest and build a crop that you could sell. But if we want developing countries, for global south countries, for themselves and for the rest of the world to take, invest in, a greener economies, greener ways of living, don't we need to put other money in, not just cancel debt? Because that's not going to be enough, surely.
Well, I would say it would be, because our standard of living is unsustainable. And the global south countries were fine before we came along and extracted all their resources and basically put people in reservations so they couldn't make their own living. I come from Kenya, so I know a direct experience of what happened there. They were fine. These countries are living sustainably, but if they're told that they're poor and they have to improve, they have to develop, and they compare themselves with our unsustainable standard of living, they then feel like they have to they have to acquire that standard of living for themselves, for which they need lots of money to be lent to them, which they then can't repay. And so the whole sort of cycle perpetuates itself. I think what we have to realize is that we have to reduce consumption. There's this model which was put forward by Aubrey Meyer called contraction and convergence in the early 1990s. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. But basically, yeah, what he was saying was that wealthy countries, global north, had to reduce consumption by 80% to allow global south countries to increase their consumption by 20%, which would then produce a sustainable world. So, yeah, obviously it's not the whole picture, but it is a big part of the picture.
Melanie, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would actually, I mean, I agree with what was explained by Turk, but I'd also like to add a little bit into how this whole process has and is changing our relationships with the environment, right? So during the British colonization, they had to actually bring down laborers from India to work in Sri Lanka because Sri Lankans from all races refused to work refused to do wage labor. So, but this doesn't mean that we didn't used to work before, right? We had agriculture, we had, several buildings and infrastructure that was built before, but for some reason, people refused to work for wage labor. So basically, on another sense, it's, they didn't want to work in their own lands for a salary. But over time, our perception on wage or our perception on labor has changed massively. And along with this, now we are being told that there needs to be a monetary value put on natural resources or the ecosystem services. This is changing the way that we are dealing with environment or our relationship with the environment. And with the changes of the agriculture, also this happened. But I think we are now coming into a more significant place where a monetary value would be placed on ecosystem services. There's currently a UNDP project is going on where they're doing a stock take of the natural capital. So so I completely agree with Turk that colonization is not a project of the past. It's still ongoing very much.
Yeah, thank you, Melanie. Did you just say that they're actually now stock taking your resources, your natural resources?
Yes,
Wow,
currently there's a UNDP project going on where they're doing a stock take of natural capital. I die a little every time I say the word natural capital.
It's really astounding. Yeah.
Hi, Melanie. I've got a question for you about tea. I've been to Sri Lanka a few times, and I realise a lot of the hills have been planted with tea, often cleared in the British colonial period. And obviously, Sri Lanka is really famous for tea. What do you think about the environmental impact of that and the sustainability of that industry going forward?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's actually a very interesting question because Sri Lanka is known for tea exports, but at the same time, it has a very interesting history. So before tea, we were growing coffee. That was also under the British plantations. But there was a disease for the coffee plantation. So then they removed coffee and started growing tea. So that was sort of the start of Ceylon tea, as you know it. But the problem is the laborers who work in these tea estates are still living in very, very harsh conditions. So they do not have right to housing. So they still live in the plantations. So it's basically slave labor. And their mobility is controlled. If the gates of the plantation is closed at 10 p.m. The people can't go and come out after that. So they're basically prisoners, open air prisoners in these areas. And they lack access to proper education. They lack access to proper health care and sanitary facilities. So these are things that I have seen and experienced with my own eyes. And but the only way that the tea market to sustain or the tea industry to sustain is by paying these people a very little daily wage. And if they are paid if they're paid a salary that actually represents the time and the energy that they spend doing hard work, the industry will not sustain. So that is I think that's where we come into the problem, understanding the labor and maintaining this current economic system. And then on the other hand of the environmental impact, tea is a plant that takes a lot of water off from the ground. And I have seen areas that has been cleared after tea plantations, like, close to 10 years, but it's very difficult to grow things in those lands because the soil has completely been degraded. But most of these areas used to be thick, dense forest before colonization. So now we are stuck with this industry, which also comprises of which also is a major part of our economy that treats the labor in a terrible, terrible way, and that degrades our environment. But still, if we get rid of it, that will be a huge blow to the economy itself as well. So, yeah, I hope that answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. I have a question. I suppose in Dirk's presentation, at the end, he was talking about one of the possible ways out of this situation is by cancelling the debt. And I'm just wondering, from your point of view, do you see like a way out for Sri Lanka possibly, or what that might look like?
Indeed, I think cancelling debt is definitely going to help Sri Lanka not only to improve our strength to face climate change, which we are already experiencing. There are several flash floods that happens, and we've experienced drought, and it's very difficult for farmers to predict their cultivation now. But with all of that, if the debt is cancelled, it would make Sri Lanka, it would put Sri Lanka in a position where we can actually plan better for our future. Because currently, all of the decisions that are being taken, because the country declared bankruptcy in 2022, and we will have to start paying our debt in 2029. So until then, we cannot actually make any decisions that is focused on the well-being of the people and our environment. But if there is a clear indication of debt cancellation, that means Sri Lanka can actually make plans aiming the well-being of the people. And also, if that is the case, we don't have to worry about repaying debt if our GDP grows, right? And when the GDP grows, that means it's the people, it's people's productivity that has gone there, and it's the natural resources of the country that has gone for that production to happen. But the majority of that, given the current condition, will be used to repay debt to the external parties. So if there is debt cancellation possible for the country at all, that would be a great advantage for the country. And I'd also like to mention that we just had elections in September, and a new government came into power with a vast parliamentary majority just a few weeks ago. So, but we constantly keep hearing that their hands are tied because of the agreements made by the previous government, the caretaker government. So if there is a clear indication of debt cancellation, that is going to free the hands of the government, and that's going to allow them to make people-friendly decisions much faster and much better. Thank you.
Thanks, Melanie. Yeah, I just feel like, it's so important that, for those of us here in the global north, that we can try and put pressure on financial institutions, because here in London, we have BlackRock, we have lots of other of these financial institutions who hold masses of this debt. But it also feels like it's really important that we strengthen our ties to you in Sri Lanka so that you can speak through us in here to really say what the real true story is, which many people just don't know about. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ben. And I'd also like to highlight that we have this massive crisis of microfinance debt, where farmers and fisheries are facing as well. So it's also this, the national situation that the country is in. We see these microcosms of theirs in communities as well. So it's, replicating these voices that takes the message forward.
Thank you, Melanie. I think we might have one more question.
For both speakers, I actually was wondering, in this sort of, when you take money out of things, and when we're actually in the middle of the climate crisis, 10, 15, 20 years, where it's reaching that peak where food is not, being produced, not enough. And countries like the UK, where we import about 50% of the food, and already you can see in local farms here that certain crops are, I wouldn't say failing, but yeah, near that. What happens when countries who, yes, they are poor, but they stop exporting their food because they need it, because they're also suffering? And what happens when you actually have food being used as to say, we'll give you food if you cancel the debt? Do you see something drastic like that ever happening in the future, where food will be used as a way to sort of pacify certain amounts of debt? Or are there any other ways in the future debt can be repaid? So maybe they won't cancel debt financially, but they will send skills and teach skills to help locals. Because I mean, there's so much talk nowadays in the news about reparations, and how reparations can come in different forms, not just hard cold cash, but skills transfer and even education. Free education.
Melanie?
Well, I hear what you're saying, that money really is it only represents work or products, goods and services. That's what money actually is. So if the debtor is unable, this is what used to happen in the olden days too, the debtor is unable to repay, they can provide produce or indentured labor. So that's, David Graeber's Debt, the first 5,000 years talks about this. You sell yourself into slavery because you can't afford to pay your debts. But I don't think it would come to that. I think it would be, I think the countries that are affected by climate change in the global south, it's much more likely that they would stop exporting their food altogether. Which means that we in this country would have to have much more expensive food because we'd have to grow our own. And we'd have to go back to a much more sustainable local economy. Interesting fun fact, 50 years ago, average disposable income, 30% of it, or 1/3 of it, was spent on food, on average. Today, it's like 5 to 7% of average disposable income. That is because we are importing so much food from countries which have much lower lower income countries than we used to 50 years ago. So if we were to return to that, an actual sustainable food supply, we'd have to up our our expenditure on food.
Thanks, Dirk. Melanie?
Yeah, well, I actually think it could happen the other way around, that if the global south countries doesn't pay the debt, we will probably lose access to, food imports, or maybe even energy. As an example, you may know that in Bangladesh there was a uprising a few months ago, and I think less than 2 months ago, Adani company, that is actually an energy supplier, said that if their credit is not paid, that they were going to disconnect electricity to Bangladesh. Right? So I think this shows once again the importance of sovereignty, especially food sovereignty, energy sovereignty for the countries, that they are no longer dependent on other governments, stronger governments, or especially on private companies. So Sri Lanka is also highly dependent on food imports for certain items. But what I would actually fear is this happening the other way around, in terms of debtor countries not being able to demand, but the creditors demanding that they be paid. And if not, there will be concessions in terms of trade and other agreements. Thank you.
Thanks, Melanie. Any other questions? No. Okay, Melanie, thank you so much, I think, and Dirk. Yeah, thank you very much to both of you. It's been really, really interesting presentation. Just out of interest, Melanie, what time is it over where you are?
It's 1:11 in the morning.
Oh dear.
Well, thank you so much for staying up for us. You know, we really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
But it's been really interesting. Yeah, thank you both.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Greg.